Hi there, and welcome back to my channel, Dr. Coco's Mnemonics. Today we're going to be going over some high-yield heart murmurs. So first we're going to start with systolic murmurs. And the first one that is always tested on every test ever is aortic stenosis, and that's going to be a crescendo decrescendo systolic murmur. And if you're ever thinking, is it systolic, is it diastolic, I always just picture the heart in my head and think if I'm squeezing, which is systolic, blood's going to be going into the aorta, correct? And should not be going into the mitral valve. So if it's a systolic murmur and you squeeze the heart going through the aorta and you hear something, that's going to be a stenotic valve. Versus if you squeeze and it's going back into the mitral valve, which it shouldn't be, that would be a regurgitation. So if you're ever in the test and you're like, oh, is this systolic or diastolic? You can kind of picture the heart in your head and figure out which it is. And that's the first thing I do when I see a question is I'm like, okay, they said it's a systolic murmur. Let me go through and mark out everything that's not systolic. And that usually helps narrow it down to about 2 or 3 answer choices. So aortic stenosis, I always think of aortic stenosis since it's common in elderly people that your life is going to go up and then back down. So that's that crescendo decrescendo, and you can think of the peak as like, I don't know, your 30s or 40s, whatever you think is like the peak of your life. But it's going to definitely go down when you get old and you can't walk or do the things you want to anymore. So that's aortic stenosis. Next, as a general rule of thumb, if they say it's a blowing murmur, that's going to be a regurgitation. And I always think of it as like if you give a blowjob, you're going to want to throw up or regurg, right? Kind of gross, I'm sorry. But if you can remember that if it says a blowing murmur, that's going to be a regurgitation. That's going to help you a lot because then you can decide, okay, where is it on the chest? Is it mitral or tricuspid? Or is it aortic or pulmonic? So blowing murmurs, blowjobs make you regurg. Next, we have a mitral valve prolapse, and this causes a mid-systolic click. And the way I think of it is, you know, when something clicks in your head and you're like, oh, I understand this forever now. Well, then you're the MVP, right? You are the MVP or mitral valve prolapse because that thing clicked in your head. Most valuable player, right? So, MVP, mid-systolic click. Next, we have the diastolic murmurs. So another one, if it's regurging, this is going to be a blowing murmur, right? So aortic regurg, blowing. You can also think of AR, are you going to blow me, for that blowing murmur. And then mitral stenosis, I think of MS as Microsoft, and I have an Apple product, but everybody used to have a Microsoft computer back in the day, and that's an operating system. So MS, Microsoft is an operating system. And operating system is for the opening snap that you would hear after your S2. So these are the 2 diastolic murmurs. Next, we have some of the congenital murmurs that you'll hear. So first we have the atrial septal defect. And so this one I think of a wide splitting S2, like you split your ass, so AS for ass, and your ass is split into 2 butt cheeks, right? So you split the S2. And if you ever, no matter how old the patient is, if you have a question step that says there's a wide splitting S2, you need to put atrial septal defect and move on with your day. Do not double check, do not convince yourself it's something else. Wide splitting S2, you split your ass in 2 butt cheeks. VSD, ventricular septal defect, is a holosystolic murmur at the left lower sternal border. And that's obviously a hole, right? You're talking about a septal defect. And so I always just say it's a VSD, a ventricular sternal defect. And so this will help you know that it's at the left lower sternal border. And it's a hole for holosystolic. Last is a PDA, or a patent ductus arteriosus, and this is where your aorta and pulmonic will be connected. And And this is a continuous machine-like murmur, so I always think of like PDA, like public displays of affection. And when you're in high school, like there's just kids making out constantly, so like that was a continuous issue for continuous murmur in PDA. Next, we're going to do some common EKGs that you'll see. So AFib, they always just describe it as irregularly irregular with no P waves. The way I think of it is the word fibrillation is kind of just really weird. It's an irregular word in my head, so irregularly irregular fibrillations. Versus flutter, I kind of think of like a bird or a butterfly fluttering its wings. And they usually do those at a continuous beat. And so if you look at that 4-to-1 sawtooth pattern of your atria fluttering, then maybe that'll help you remember atrial flutter. Last is ventricular fibrillation. There's not really a good way of memorizing this other than I think of all of the different medical shows I've seen, and they're like, oh, he's in VFib, shock him. Well, it just pretty much means there is no rhythm. You don't know what the heck's going on, and you have to shock this patient or they're gonna die. AV blocks. So first degree, you literally just have a prolonged PR interval. It's like a finding the patient doesn't really have any symptoms. You just see it on EKG and you're like, oh my god, what is this? Well, it's a prolonged PR interval. Would be a first degree AV block. Second degree AV block, somebody at school taught me this, and I wish I could give her credit. I don't remember her name, but this one is, you just say this sentence, longer, longer, longer drop. That is a winky block. And so that'll help you remember that these PR intervals, they just keep getting longer and longer and longer, and then all of a sudden you just don't have a QRS, it just drops. Like that QRS decided to go home and take a nap. That is going to be a second degree AV block, or also called a winky block. Third degree or a complete AV block, I just think of the atria and the ventricles, they broke up. They are not dating anymore, they're not friends, so they aren't talking, and so you'll see all these P waves where the atria's like, hey, I'm contracting, and then the ventricles are like, no, screw you, I'm not going to contract. And so when your atria and your ventricles are not working together, that's going to be a third degree AV block. Last, this is a concept that I sat down, I thought of something to memorize it, and this got me many questions right on NBMEs and STEP, and so I thought I would share this with you. It might be simple, something everybody knows, but I didn't. So S3 is an ED, or early diastole. And so you'll see it either said it's an early diastole, or they'll say where it is on the EKG. But the way that I like to think of it, if you can remember S3 is ED, well, what else is ED? If we're not even talking about the heart, that's erectile dysfunction, right? And so that's when you're not getting enough blood to your genital area as a male. So ED, I remember you're not getting enough blood, so you want to dilate that. You know, you want to give like Viagra or something. So ED is dilated cardiomyopathy as well. And so then you're like wanting to put more blood in there so that the man can do whatever he, wants to do. So it's also things that are going to have an increased filling pressure. So if you can remember, S3 is ED. It's early diastole, but it's also going to be dilated cardiomyopathy. And then last is S4. S4, they have for LD as late diastole, but I like to think of 4 as fat. And so you just have this like really fat ventricle. And what does that mean? Well, that would be like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So you just have this really fat ventricle, and he's really struggling to pump blood through. And so this little concept of just remembering what S3 and S4 are more likely seen in has gotten me a lot as far as content review and figuring out what's wrong with the patient in those long stems where they give you so much information. Hopefully this has helped. If it has, please like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.